EBN supports the development and growth of entrepreneurs, of startups, of SMEs. Is responsible innovation of relevance for them?
It is in a different manner, but EBN caters collectively. Our incubators, accelerators cover for close to 25,000 startups and SMEs. So it's a very broad array of companies. Among them, you have those that have a vision that starts from responsibility. You call it social responsibility, you call it, different people will have different definitions. Others don't start from that angle. It's just something that they learn as they progress in developing the business models. They try to anticipate the market, and they figure it out that it is about sustainability, that it is about the market expectations and the population expectations about the new technology, that they start to cover the subject. So you've got almost two entry points to this: those that come in convinced with it and they want to implement it from the beginning, and those that discover it as they go and suddenly they get familiar with it and they get very involved in it and apply it.
What's the motivation of the ones that take sustainability as a part of their DNA, as a part of their mission?
This is all very related to a personal stance on what we do and what is the purpose of what we do professionally and personally. So a lot of people would take that for granted and say, if I have to start a startup and this is what I want to do, I want my startup to be socially responsible from the beginning, or I want it to be responsible altogether, whether it's societal responsibility or whether it is other areas. They tend to start with a solution to a problem, and the problem tends to be a societal issue. Whether it is environment, whether it is clean tech, whether it is societal issues, they tend to come from that angle. And then they develop the company and they figure it out. And this is a trend that I see in the market as we go forward, that companies that started as social companies, today I see those companies being regular companies with a very social mind, but not profile themselves as a social company. They will profile themselves as a regular company. This is what everybody would expect us to do, and this is what we believe in. But it's not that you develop a business model to be social. You develop your business model and it happens to be social. It's a little bit of a different approach to this, which is fundamental in the way you approach the company, the way you approach the financial sustainability of the company, the way you approach your product development, the access to markets, how you talk to your investors or your potential investors. That has changed over the years, which I think is a very good trend because it generalizes the perception that responsibility is part of the DNA of any new startup. Is that 100%? Certainly not. And there are big questions out there that we have been discussing, but it is a trend that I find very healthy and very a ground trend in the way the startups and the new entrepreneurs profile themselves.
Do you think that responsibility and sustainability can be a source of creativity to develop different business models?
There are some people that only want to focus on that responsibility element, but I suspect that the more successful companies tend to focus on the market needs, on the citizen needs, and on the citizen perceptions, consumer perceptions, whether it's directly because they're serving a B2C type of business or indirectly because they're going through another company. And I think that the population is more and more aware of data protection, for example, or personal data protection. Certainly, it's more and more aware about the different usage that a certain technology could have for the good or the bad purpose. I think that kind of thing is forcing entrepreneurs to think twice before they launch the business model. But it would not necessarily say that it is because of this responsibility element, it is because of the market feedback that they're getting, where responsibility needs to be part of the DNA of whatever they do.
And what about sustainability? In research, there is quite a heavy debate about circular economy, about selling services instead of selling products, new business models of sharing economy. Could sustainability be a source of creativity for startups and for entrepreneurs?
It is, and it has to be. Meaning it is not just a source of creativity, it is a condition of survival. For me, it is condition of survival. If I'm launching a startup, or one of our entrepreneurs comes and asks for support and advice, I say, okay, think about next month, think about next year, but where do you want to be in 10 years' time? What kind of company do you want to be? What do you anticipate that the market is going to be demanding from you? And the market is consuming more and more bioproducts, green economy derived products. There's a lot of crowdfunding going in that direction, if you think about that. So it is also an immediate way to get access to a different collectivity that could be your founders. I think there is a fundamental trend in there. So it is about sustainability. So responsibility comes with the person, and then you transfer it to your company. But I think it is about sustainability of the company you want to set up, and the societal changes. The societal mindset is forcing companies to change, and vice versa. One nurtures the other. It is indissociable. It's not a one-directional, it is a bi-directional relationship.
One key element of responsible innovation is assessing future impacts. Assessing future impacts might also help companies to reduce the risks that their products or services are simply not accepted by citizens and not successful on markets. Do you think that such kind of forecasting exercises could help companies, could help startups before implementing their new business?
However hard you think about the future is always going to surprise you. So you think about risk limitation, you think about how you focus your business model, what kinds of products or services you want to launch in the marketplace, and you try to anticipate that. There's a point in the life of a company, in the growth life of the company, where these companies are confronted with pitching to investors. And investors themselves have evolved from impact investing into general investing with an impact element onto that, if I can summarize it. Now, once they're confronted with that, any investor would expect to do a due diligence on a number of elements. So one is the technical aspects, the other one will be the team, the other one will be certainly the risk elements. So where is this product, service, or this technology taking me, and where are the risk elements? So you're going to have different people looking at the same element, coming from completely different angles, the investors and the entrepreneur. The entrepreneur is in love with the product and the service. The investor is not. The investor is in love with the market that it represents, the potential market that it represents. And therefore, the two different views about the risk that a certain technology implies in the market are going to be very helpful at doing precisely that risk profiling and limitation. That is what any company and investor would end up doing around a discussion table.
Do investors consider responsible innovation as an asset or as a problem, taking care of responsibility issues?
There was a time, and I sound very old when I say this, but there was a time when we were discussing with United Nations the principles of responsible investment. And this was because they had come up with the principles, and they wanted to apply that to private equity and venture capital, where I was involved in the past. Now, we took those principles and converted them into something that could be applicable by the private equity and venture capital industry, and it was very successful, meaning from the initial difficulties as accepting that something was imposed on them to the actual realization that this was important for the sustainability of the sectors, for the sustainability of the companies underneath. Now we are at a place where from responsible investing, we're getting into responsible innovation. And I do like the principles logic. I find that you write the principles and everyone has to adapt that to his or her own reality. Whether you're an investor, whether you're a startup, whether you are a support organization for these startups. And that reality is very different. It's different country by country, it's country market per market, it's different if you B2B or B2C and how you manage your responsibility. So it is a very different world. Pretending to have rules for everybody, I don't believe in that. I prefer by far, and I believe in it, in the capacity of each individual to take the principles and apply them and think about them, because it's forcing them to think, not just to do the tick box thing, but rather to think thoroughly about how to apply these principles in my company, how do I make sure they are sustainable over the long term. So whenever I move out of the company, whenever somebody takes over, or whenever the team has become so large that it's difficult to pretend that you control it, the principle's still there and they're still being applicable. So I like the principles logic. And coming back to your question, I think that is where I would see the companies going. Take principles of responsible innovation as such, or responsible investment, they're not very far away, and do apply them in a bespoke manner for each of the companies. So everybody has to do an internalization of those principles and then say, okay, what does this mean for my company? How do I put it to work?
If you compare principles to other steering mechanisms, just like standards, what are the advantages of principles compared to standards?
Standards are done on the basis of the past experience. They are by definition obsolete the moment they get published, and they do not cover market realities as they evolve, and certainly not in this fast change pace type of market. So for me, standards are not valid in that direction. I like, when it comes to responsibility issues, when it comes to ethics, when it comes to how you approach things from a personal and from a moral perspective, principles are a much better suited vehicle. What you can do is complement those principles with tools. Say, I read the principles, find fantastic, they look great on paper, then what does that mean for me and how do I apply them? And that becomes very difficult. And why would I do the whole exercise if somebody has done it before and can give me some guidelines about things that I should be looking into? And this is the kind of tools that we have developed at the Compass project, the kind of tools that I see out there in the marketplace. Those are useful. Those are very useful tools because still forces you as an entrepreneur to think about it, forces you to have a very thorough reflection about what does it mean for my company, how to put it to place, but it gives you tools. It gives you capacity to go and react relatively fast to things that are fundamentally complex.
Global Compact, for example, is also based on principles, but it also has a mechanism for quality control. Do principles need such a mechanism?
I think it depends on the maturity of the company. I think it would be naive to pretend that a 3-founder company can have an ethics committee. Come on, let's be realistic. That doesn't fly. We need to be very realistic on things. Companies have their own life, they have their own process, they have their own maturity periods, and as that materializes, you will have an immediate first filter with your advisor, you have a second filter, if you want to, with your investors that are going to be asking all the nasty questions, and they're going to be looking into this because it is part of their sustainability checklist. And eventually, when you go beyond that level, you may very well want to establish an ethics committee and so on. So the logic is absolutely fine. It needs to be adapted to the growth path of the company, and every company is going to be slightly different. You ask any of the founders in a 3-people company when they're going to do this, they say, well, I already work the whole week, plus the Saturdays, plus the Sundays. I don't see when I can look into this. I think it's a very mom and pop type of thinking. It is about the size of the company. And the size of the company tends to be related to their impact in society as well. Tends to be related to how capable are they of changing society or not, or influencing it. And therefore, in your risk assessment, you need to take that into account. So for me, it is a process. It is not, we need to understand that this is not something that I do once a year because I have an audit, or once a year because I have an ethics committee. This is something that I have to do every day, and I have to make sure that it happens every day, whether I'm vigilant or not. My team needs to continue doing that. Now that's what we try to convey to the companies. Think about this as a continuum. This is part of your DNA, so it is every day, not the day when you have a committee. So how do you go by that? What is it that it makes also that part sustainable?
So principles on the one hand have a kind of benefit that comes from inside the company. So this is identity, this is a mission, this is a kind of governance and motivation of people, but it also has an outside value, a market value. If companies point to these principles and say, yes, we commit ourselves to these principles, we are the good guys. In this case, I think it's important that it's more than one sheet of paper, so that it's really filled implemented in daily life. So for example, if these principles say transparency and fairness, these are nice terms. How can it be ensured that transparency and fairness is really taken up in daily life?
I think the moment an entrepreneur takes the step of publicly making available those principles and saying this is what we stand for, you are opening yourself, or this entrepreneur is opening himself or herself to public scrutiny. And it is not enough to say, these are the principles. It's very vague principles, right? And then people can check. How can they check? So if I do that, I need to make sure that I have a dialogue mechanism with my clients, with the market, that they can possibly check and ask questions about that. And I need to make sure that somebody in the company has got time to answer those questions and to make sure that the responses are relevant.
Developing principles requires the involvement of a broad diversity of actors. If principles are only developed by companies, for companies, they might not have the same reputation as if, for example, critical NGOs, policy, or society are involved. Do you think it's better to develop principles just by companies, for companies, or in a multi-stakeholder setting?
By definition, a multi-stakeholder setting. The trouble would arise if you go from principles to something that is more detailed, because then it is not necessarily adapted to the life and the needs of a company. If you're strict about sticking to principles level, then certainly a multi-stakeholder, because we are catering for societal issues. We're catering for the evolution of our societies, the market expectation, the public expectation, the consumer expectation at the end of the day. So it needs to be broad. It needs to be broad-based. My concern is always going 2 levels down into principles that look like obligations that are not necessarily well adapted, where somebody with a very good purpose has come up with something that is simply not adapted. So if we stick to principles, clearly a multi-stakeholder.
Do you think such principles need to be sector-specific?
If you stick to principles, it is universal. It is never sector-specific. You can do a specific interpretation of the principles for a sector-specific. We spoke a minute ago about United Nations. Global Compact, and they started with principles of responsible investment. You have now the Clean Ocean Initiative in the United Nations. So it is almost an interpretation of the same thing applied specifically to the seas, to the oceans. That makes sense, and it sticks to the principles level, but it's got some very specific applications. But doing sector-specific principles, I think it deters from its ultimate purpose.
What are the most important pitfalls that should be avoided when developing principles?
Going into detail? I don't think there are other. I think it is always complicated. You always get all kinds of different views. People view the world in a different way. And if you want to integrate all that, it takes discussion on roundtables and debate and public debate. Fine, that is the complexity of the exercise. Going into detail is always the complicated element. That's why, for me, it is so important to have the principles and to leave every citizen, every company, every NGO, and every public initiative to adopt the principles and adapt them to the situation.
Are you aware of any initiative developing principles for responsible innovation at the moment?
I'm aware of discussions rather than initiatives, particularly in the domain of data protection, which is related to artificial intelligence or to blockchain, which was meant to be a solution precisely to how data is being treated and kept. I think we're living in a digital world, so data protection has become a big issue for the citizen. I think we need to make a distinction about what is the ultimate information that is given to citizens, not for the record, not for the those complex conditions, pages and pages of small typos where nobody can read through. No regular citizen can read through those, but rather being very, very transparent about what it is that companies are going to do with data or not, even if it is in simplified terms that can be complemented with legal terms afterwards. I think companies taking that stance more and more. I see some of the new apps that you get on their phones and so on being very clear about what they do with the data, and I see some others not being that transparent. But are they working towards responsible innovation principles specific for that element? I'm not aware of.
Suppose the Living Innovation Project would think about developing principles for responsible innovation. Do you think that would be a good idea?
If we stick to principles, yes, fantastic. if we stick to principles. I insist on what I told you before. I think it is about making sure that everybody understands that there needs to be universal principles if you want to adapt it to a specific element, which is innovation, which is one of those that is most promising on the one hand, on the other hand, most scary in some circumstances, but it is to stick to principles. In that case, it will be very useful.
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.